Welcome to the third episode of our podcast series, in which hot topics, including new initiatives and alternative viewpoints on patient engagement within the life sciences sector, will be covered. Although patient engagement is more and more common nowadays, it's absolutely crucial that it is also meaningful and sustainable. With this podcast series, we would like to contribute to achieving that goal. My name is Roger Lechtenberg and I'm senior partner and co-owner of admedicum. And today I thought it would be interesting to share with you several extracts from a recent LinkedIn Live event that was moderated by my colleague Rob and starred Tom Smith, an independent patient consultant, together with Andreas Reimann, co-founder and managing partner of admedicum, who shared their thoughts on the roles and best practices for patient involvement in HTA processes. To introduce Tom a bit further, being an independent patient consultant at above disease level, he translates his own experiences of living with cystic fibrosis into positive change in the UK and globally. He is also a patient engagement editor at DIA Global and a board member of CF Europe. So now let's move to the extracts of the event, where Andreas gave an introduction to the topic, and I would like to pick it up at the moment when he started discussing last-minute patient involvement while a dossier for a new treatment is already under regulatory review.
Of course, you can involve patients exactly at that time, so at the last minute. And believe it or not, we as admedicum still receiving calls saying, "Oh, we are about to submit an HTA dossier within the next 4 weeks. Can you help us to do meaningful patient involvement?" And the answer, of course, is clear. There is nothing you can do at that moment in time. It's really the last minute. You can look to the data, you can discuss it, but you won't change it. In clinical development, you start with early stakeholder involvement actually at the beginning of the clinical development phase. Even actually before you can discuss with patients the target product profile. And that will then help to untap the potential that is in when you involve patients at the right moment, that's early. Then you can make sure that evidence is created that is really meeting the needs of patients and that is really patient relevant, rather than just repeating what other companies have done before or just meeting the minimum regulatory requirements. And I'm very pleased to see that at least the FDA is starting to pay a lot of attention to early patient involvement during development rather than only at a late stage. Now, what could patient-based HTA look like at different stages? Well, right at the beginning, of course, identify and to nominate the topic for the assessment. That's based very much, of course, as all HTA processes are really national. This is very much based on what is offered by the specific system, but certainly the participation in the technical and scientific assessment and the evidence appraisal as such. These are core elements where patient representatives can raise their voice, can provide input to at different stages. We realize that there are big differences across Europe where and at what time that could be done and in what format. Very formalized procedures like in France, like in Germany, like in the UK, and some and also in Belgium, but some less formalized procedures in other countries. Still, there is a place where patients can provide input to the appraisal, but that is always based on the data that is available at that time, as I said.
Following the introduction by Andreas, Tom continued with giving an inspiring overview on his viewpoints and the importance for patients to be involved in HTA processes.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name's Thomas Smith, as Rob delightfully explained. I'm very happy with my introduction, but I'm not that boring. I do have a personality outside of those kind of things. I just wanted to pick up on something that you said, Andreas, which is how HTA is such a tiny part of the process, and how a metaphor kind of jumped to my mind, and I'm not a rocket scientist, But I do know that in rocket propulsion, there's a huge amount of fuel that mixes in a throat and the power comes out the other end. And it's that focus really that I think HGA is. It can really generate a lot of pressure, both good and bad, because there's a huge amount of work that kind of culminates there, and it's make or break, and a lot of patients don't know that. But I think the best way to approach HGA and patient engagement is to really think of this from the preclinical stage. It needs to be something which is, we need to be touching base with patients every single step of the way. And like Andreas said, I'm sure admedicum would be useful and helpful at 4 weeks before an HGA appraisal, but really we don't want to put admedicum in that position, because that sounds quite stressful. And also you don't want to put yourselves in that position either, for the same reason, because ultimately patients need drugs, companies need to sell them, and regulators need to assess them. That's the way it is. But the good news is that there's a lot of work that can be done, because it's just not on the patient community's radar at all, really. Obviously, there are some high-profile examples of that, where it is on the radar, but it doesn't go well. I'm a cystic fibrosis patient, as was mentioned, and we had a huge public fight with a company about an amazing drug, which is very expensive, and it was completely uncontained, and like I say, nobody looked good during that kind of argument. So there's a lot of road to cover, really, and the only way is up, I suppose, because this is a relatively new thing. Patient engagement and HGA kind of coming together is a new thing. Like Andrea said, UPATI just launched something yesterday, I believe you said. And UPATI is an amazing organisation, and it's way ahead of everybody else as far as a school and an educational resource goes. But they're still, just getting on it now. So there's a lot of distance to cover. Things are going to get better, which gives people like me hope, because this is what I'm interested in, and it means that there's plenty of work to do. I just want to touch on a few things, both from the patient organisation side of things, from the patient community, and also potentially the sponsors and anybody else who's interested. I think that one of the first things we need to fix and work on is raising public awareness of the health technology assessment process, because like I say, I'm not that comfortable with the term patient expert for a number of different reasons, but I am professionally inclined to be interested in this and understand how it works, and I'm seeing an increase in the amount of work that I'm getting in this area. But beyond that, it's extremely niche, which betrays the actual value of it, because like Andrea said, this is like a tiny part of it where there's a huge focus of pressure. And I think that if we can build awareness of it, then we're going to get better at, communication strategies, public pressure campaigns, things like that. So I think we really need to do a better job, us in the community and potentially the sponsor side as well. Just, saying, hey guys, health technology assessment is a thing. It's not as simple as making a drug and being able to give it to you. I think that, and on that, it needs to be accessible. I speak often about how it's not the sexiest thing in the world. It's not the most engaging topic to someone who's not professionally inclined to participate in this area. So I think we need to make it accessible with materials that people can understand, and we need to do what we can to make it fun. And I think at the moment, like I said, because there is such a tiny amount of people who are aware of the HTA process, meaningfully aware in the patient community, we are essentially losing out on a huge amount of compelling data and evidence, because most of it just gets lost to the ether, because people are living their lives, they're trying to deal with their illness, and they're not particularly interested in what's happening in regulatory bodies, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a huge amount of value to add to it. So I think that from the sponsor side, one of the most important things is, like I said, the HTA process really starts at the preclinical phase and about priority settings. We need to communicate with the patient community to establish primary endpoints that actually matter to them. all this is easier said than done. Like I say, it's relatively new, but that's essentially what it boils down to. I think that there are examples where drugs are reimbursed in certain territories and not others, and where those kind of awkward things happen. We need to communicate things clearly. We need to get patient communities to work together to generate the evidence that we need, because obviously the HTA process is evidence-based. And sometimes, in rare, ultra-rare diseases, there isn't, a huge amount of infrastructure there to collect this kind of thing. So we really need to work together across borders to pull it all into one place. I think that also, we can ramp up political pressure. As I was mentioning before, that the public and uncontained argument for some of my treatment a few years ago, that was a hugely effective. Really, public pressure is all that kind of turn the tide, because as far as I know, where the UK government was and whether the sponsor wanted the amount of money there was a huge gulf, and I was amazed that they actually agreed to it. And it's all because, as much as it was undignified a bit, it was just, creating outside of the CF community, this drug is amazing. People are dying without it. And, politicians and payers, they need to listen to that at a certain point. I think we could do a lot more to co-create trial protocols that fit into people's lives. And I think that we also need to just work on how we think about doing that. And again, like, the patient community is not aware that you can have any kind of input on a trial protocol or the endpoints or collecting data or anything like that. And I think the last thing I'll touch on is that from the patient community side of things, essentially the HTA process and the patient engagement process that within that is all about strengthening the argument to pay for a drug. So it's really important that we build a really clear picture of what this disease is actually like and how this particular treatment is going to either improve or extend the life of a patient. And I think, it's just really interesting how it's really compelling stuff. It's really compelling stuff, and it can't be argued with. But unless we have the data, it just kind of doesn't exist, if you know what I mean. Understandably, because that's how these things work. There are managed access programs which are hugely influential, as I have experienced in my own life. I was granted access to a drug on compassionate grounds because of my clinical kind of markers fell below a certain limit, and I have absolutely no doubt that combined with the political pressure has changed everything. And like I say, this drug has completely transformed my life, and we just need to make sure that where similar innovation exists, we can actually get it into people's hands.
So let's now continue after the introductions with a selection of questions that were asked during the session.
Arun says, tapping into the full potential entails that HTA bodies actually include, for example, patient preference evidence in their assessment. However, there seems to not be agreement across HTA bodies about how to do this, including patient preference evidence in assessments. Any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks very much, Arun. That's a great comment. Unfortunately, you are absolutely right. There is no agreement on how to include patient preference information. Yes, there is an agreement that at least in most of the HTA authorities, that it is important to understand what is actually important to patients. How to find this out? There are different opinions, and certainly there are debates about the right methodology. Patient preference information can give that insight. It can help to understand in a systematic way what is really important to patients in certain situations. You can always argue that these are artificial studies, and these are it's a kind of artificial setting if patients are presented, for instance, a particular set of characteristics of a potential medicinal product, and they can they have to make discrete choices and have to do this repeatedly. Yes, they are not exactly in that situation, and yes, it's not the actual treatment situation. You can always argue, but that's why it is called an experiment. But it provides a quantifiable insight, and I can only agree that we should help convincing authorities to pay more attention to this. And actual patient organizations can do a great deal in advocating for that. They can talk to the national authorities, certainly within the new European process and the joint and European HTA. There should be a place for that actually. Tom, any thoughts on that?
As you said, they're completely right. HTA bodies just want more and more patient engagement, and at the moment, it's not that clear exactly what they want and what they mean by that, which is frustrating. It's definitely frustrating, but I suppose we have to be balanced and pragmatic and kind and say, this is a complex process, and we're trying to figure things out. But I think that patient preference studies, they're an amazing way to find out what actually matters and obviously what patients prefer, but actually it's part of a wider dialogue, which is just bringing people in. And I think that has value in itself as well.
I was wondering if you had any concrete advice about, for all those patient representatives out there who might be listening and want to get started in contributing to HTA processes. It could seem a bit daunting and they might not know quite where to go. Are there any, first steps or resources? Of course, we mentioned UPATI before to check out, but what else helped you on your journey of learning about the HTA process, and what would you recommend to other fellow patient advocates?
What helps me on my journey is something at which I do not advocate, which is unfortunately being interested in everything. The fact that I'm now in a position to come on this kind of thing is actually, in my specific circumstances, a result of a very broad and wide amount of curiosity in all things patient engagement. But I do have some advice. I think that no matter which territory you're in, you need to connect with your national HTA body, because they're probably going to have some kind of PPI, patient public involvement kind of network or involvement and engagement opportunities. And what I would advise is, if you can, where you can, participate. You don't necessarily need any prior knowledge at all, and in some cases that has more value. Sometimes they want to know what people who aren't familiar with the process think. And so, for example, with the MHRA in the UK, they have something called the Patient Group Consultative Forum, which is exactly that. You say hello, you send an email saying that you're interested in this, as is signposted on their website. And once you're in the club, they send newsletters every single month about public engagement opportunities for people who, like I say, have no experience or knowledge to participate. Then what I would do, this is working on the assumption that you'll have a connection with a patient organization, and I'm speaking purely from the patient side of things, then connect with them. And by the way, these steps are interchangeable. You don't need to do one and the other. You can do both at the same time or the opposite. So you need to connect with your patient organization, tell them what you're doing, and share what you've learned from the national HTA body, and that's how you can help. That's and depending on the I suppose scarcity or how rare the disease is, they might be crying out for anybody who knows anything to actually help them with anything, any number of different things. The third thing I would say is, like you said, Rob, at that point, if you have a fever for the flavor, as they say, educate yourself. Connect with, in Europe, we have organizations like UPATI, the European Patient Academy for Therapeutic Innovation. They have a qualification called the Fellowship, which is a big, 14-month in-depth course, which is, it's no small commitment. It's something I've done myself, and I loved every single second of it. There's also, there's EURODIS, there's the European Patients Forum. And like I say, because patients involving and participating in the HTA process is becoming more and more of a burgeoning issue, as was said before, these kind of schools, that's what they're sort of patient schools, are taking an increasingly serious approach to it as well. And the fourth thing I would say, which cannot be underestimated, you need to build your network. You do not need to connect only with people who are familiar with your particular set of circumstances. If anything, it's way more interesting to look outside of that. For example, one of the great things that I love about the patient community is that it is international. So I've gone from feeling very isolated to connecting with a global community of people who know what it's like to not have a straightforward life. And these people, they're all essentially pushing for the same thing, which is better outcomes for either themselves, their family members, people they care about, or just, the wider moral imperative of just people having better health. And it's a very productive and constructive community to be a part of. But, you can only access that if you're able to learn how to speak to people that you don't know. For example, that's a huge barrier. But yeah, the last and one of the most important is definitely building your network.
I can't agree more. Let me say one additional thing. Probably it's important to plan well ahead in time, and that's hard for patient organization because there's so much struggling with the daily access issues, the care, getting organizing and advocating for better care, and obviously also helping their membership. So they may not be aware that to act meaningfully in an HTA process, that needs preparation for their own too. So I was talking about early patient involvement from a developer point of view, from a pharmaceutical and medical device point of view, but actually in a way it's also true for patient organization. You need to prepare probably 2 years ahead to make sure that you're really focusing on those objectives that are really most important to you, that matters. So you identify gaps, knowledge and capability gaps, and then you can partner with other patient organizations or other partners. And we are at admedicum also very happy to support where we can to fill that gap. But unfortunately, that needs also time, and that takes time, especially when you're working with volunteers.
So let me just jump on the back of that, and maybe we could kind of distill that into a soundbite for sponsors, which is there is never too much time or advance warning to give patient organizations. If you are developing something with promise, please speak to them as often and as early as you can.
So true. When you see the industry supporting HTA, patient involvement in HTA, what sorts of strategies or activities are they doing and undertaking? What are some of the best practices that industry can do to support HTA involvement of patients while still remaining neutral?
It's certainly a delicate issue, and let's be quite open and honest. There are issues around confidentiality. There are things around conflict of interest. Patients who are in very close relationship in the process, in preparing the process of their involvement in HTA processes with a certain industrial sponsor may not be suitable for official involvement in HTA processes later on, and so on and so forth. So it's a delicate issue still. I know a couple of companies which are very much interested in providing support to empower patients to better understand HTA process in general, rather than preparing for a certain process. So the best way certainly is to do this on arm's length, not to be involved in a direct fashion, but to provide for instance, to provide unrestricted educational grants, clearly to say that they are provided by a certain company. Never play on the hidden agendas. Just say this is provided by company X. But then let that do by an independent contractor or vendor or organization, to make sure that there is no influence, there is no bias based on a certain product. I have to say it needs to be done really transparent and with all respect to the independence of all the organizations involved.
Nice, thanks. Anything to add, Tom?
Well, it just popped into my head something which I feel like I've been speaking a lot about recently, which is that there is just generally a lack of soft skill training. Obviously, participating in the HTA process it's just about, I suppose, connecting with organizations, with people in unfamiliar environments, unfamiliar settings, unfamiliar vernacular and registers, and it's a completely different sort of glossary of terms, shall we say, a lot of the time. And I think we could just obviously patient organizations have 1,000,001 pressing issues, but there is also a lack of capacity and just kind of soft skills and confidence and giving people what they need to actually participate in these conversations as well.
I can't agree more. I mean, soft skills are often underestimated. And yes, there is the knowledge part, there is the educational part, there is training and so on and so forth. But certainly, sometimes I see patient representatives who have so much to tell, who have so much knowledge about they actually and people they know, and they can generalize about this, know about how, that disease and how meaningful a certain treatment can be or not, and how meaningful certain data can be or it cannot be meaningful, but they have difficulties to express themselves, or are shy and or feel marginalized themselves, feel not to be well set up to talk to people who they never met before. Yeah, that's so. Tom, I really can't agree more. Training on so-called soft skills, they are very strong skills, actually, very, very hard skills. But, yeah.
Absolutely, and it's in such a focused area as well. Like if you've been to medical school, you've done different bits and pieces. You work in CF. The consultants work with the same sort of 12 inpatients and maybe 20 or 30 outpatients every single day. They have the same question, same conversation with different people several times a day. And you mentioned something, Andreas, about people marginalizing themselves, but people are also marginalized. We have this huge issue with doctor-patient kind of thing, and now more than ever, those kind of balances, thank God, are addressing, and it is changing people's lives. People can advocate for themselves, they're growing in confidence. But actually, I think a lot of the time, patient communities, they marginalize themselves, but there is just this pervasive culture that if you have a disease, if you're down on your luck for any reason, you don't have anything of value to add, and it just couldn't be further from the truth. So I love talking about that kind of thing.
I'm based in Spain, where patient involvement in HTA is not as well organized or structured. What do you have to say? And there's many countries like Spain, Italy, I think, is in a similar situation too, with actually regional HTA bodies as well, and not a national HTA body, and then lack of clarity about patient involvement in those groups. So for those patient advocates that are living in these countries where it's not mandated as part of the assessment, how can they still share the patient's voice? How can they still get involved?
I think that there's tons of things you can do. And like I said before, HTA is essentially a conversation about whether drug X is worth paying Y amount of money for. And for example, that's a concept that people need to learn. And I think that you can still start to build evidence. You can still start to look at outside. When I was talking about creating a network and working outside of your disease area, there is still, because the patient engagement community is global, there are tons and tons of examples where you can find how patient engagement became mandatory, and what people are doing now that it is mandatory in those different territories. And basically, you can just speak to people and find out. You know, you can start banging the drum. You can start building relationships with other organizations. You can start gathering data and evidence and collating the priorities of your community. But essentially, I can't advocate enough speaking to other people who are a bit further down the road, finding out what you can learn. And then there's no shame in it whatsoever, because this is a fundamental humanitarian thing. We can just take those lessons and pull them into our own community.
Yeah. And you can certainly, you can always talk to decision makers. You can try to approach them. You can publicly voice and raise your voices. Also inviting other potential allies like clinicians, like learned societies, to join forces and to advocate to get the message of the patients across, and to get the needs of the patients across to decision makers. And of course, you can act publicly and advocate in policy to improve the formal participation of patients. Certainly, the European HTA process may also be in the future, I have to say. It starts with oncology and rare disease in 25.
At the end of the event, final thoughts were shared by Tom and Andreas.
This is a really interesting time in health economics. And I'm just, honestly, as we say in English, buzzing. I'm excited to see where it goes. And like I say, we're starting small, understandably, because we have to start somewhere. The only thing that I should warn against is a fear of failure. I think if we just have to try, we have to trust our judgment, we have to put our best foot forward, and that will almost certainly be enough. But we can't worry too much about doing too much patient engagement or doing it in the wrong way. It's all about just trying to, I suppose, get a wider conversation started, and we'll figure it out together.
Actually, HTA, the involvement of patients in HTA processes, I think, is not a nice to have. It is really mandatory to make those HTA processes meaningful to the society, to the medical community, and most important also to a better care of patients. So we should all try our very best to advocate for better involvement here. Thanks.
And with that, I would like to thank Andreas and Tom, and also Rob, for their time in organizing the LinkedIn Live event and sharing their insights on the roles and best practices for patient involvement in HTA processes. And finally, I would like to also thank you, our listeners, and I hope this third episode was informative and inspirational. Please follow us on your favorite podcast platform and stay tuned for the next episode.